She journeyed across a parched land, a promise whispered on the wind, only to be met by a cruel judgment. Too poor. But sometimes the world's rejection can pave the way for a love that calls you its very essence. Before we unravel this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The train car shuddered, a metal beast tearing through the dust-choked expanse of the plains, carrying Ayanna further from the familiar sacred red earth of her Diné heritage. Each rattle of the wheels echoed the pounding of her own heart, a drumbeat of apprehension and a fragile, desperate hope. She clutched the worn shawl closer, its threads woven with the memories of a grandmother's hands, a silent testament to the life she had left behind, a life of sun-baked canyons and the whispered wisdom of generations. This new world, promised through a terse letter, was a landscape of unforgiving flatness, broken only by the skeletal frames of distant unseen ranches. The air was thin, carrying the scent of dry grass and the unspoken weight of expectation. Her hope, carefully nurtured like a rare desert bloom, was for a new beginning, a quiet life, a partner who might see past the thinness of her purse and the unfamiliar hue of her skin. She had imagined a man of quiet strength, perhaps with calloused hands, who would understand the silent language of the land. Instead, when the train finally groaned to a halt at a forgotten siding, and a figure emerged from the shimmering heat haze, her fragile hope began to crack. He was a man of sharp angles and sharper words, his gaze sweeping over her with a dismissive disdain that chilled her more than the evening wind. He spoke of finances, of expectations, of a life she couldn't afford to bring to his barren claim. The air thickened with unspoken prejudice, a dense fog of judgment that suffocated the last embers of her carefully constructed dream. She stood there, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent horizon, the silence amplifying the sting of his brutal, concise rejection. "You're too poor." The words, blunt and unyielding, lodged themselves in her chest like shards of ice, extinguishing the light she had carried across miles of desolate country. The train, her last link to a life of certainty, pulled away, leaving her utterly alone, adrift in a sea of unknown faces, each glance a reflection of the same callous disregard. The dust settled, coating her worn dress, a symbolic burial of the future she had envisioned. The words, "too poor," resonated in the hollow of her bones. A bitter anthem played on the wind. She watched him walk away, his back a stiff monument to indifference, and a new kind of emptiness unfurled within her, vast and terrifying. This was not the quiet rejection she had steeled herself for, not the polite refusal. This was a verdict, a dismissal of her very being, her worth measured and found wanting by the scale of another's meager ambition. The small, sun-bleached town offered no solace, only scrutiny. Faces peered from behind lace curtains, eyes glinting with a morbid curiosity, a silent chorus of judgment. The women, with their starched aprons and tightly pulled hair, exchanged whispers that seemed to carry on the dry breeze, dissecting her appearance, her solitude, her obvious destitution. She was an outsider, a displaced ornament, a living testament to failure in a place that valued prosperity above all else. Her few possessions, bundled in a worn carpet bag, felt heavy as stones, anchors dragging her deeper into the quicksand of despair. Where was she to go? The vastness of the plains, once a canvas for opportunity, now stretched before her as an endless, mocking expanse. A tremor ran through her, not of cold, but of a profound aloneness, a realization that the very air she breathed in this foreign land was laced with an insidious venom. She sought shelter, a place where she might simply exist without the piercing gaze of others. The general store, a repository of canned goods and curious glances, offered a brief reprieve, but even there, the proprietor's eyes held a wary suspicion, as if she might somehow taint his wares. She found herself drifting towards the edge of town, the dusty main street giving way to rutted tracks. The sun dipped, bleeding orange and purple across the sky, a cruel beauty that mocked her internal tempest. A horse whinnied in the distance, a sound both wild and mournful, echoing a loneliness she understood intimately. She saw a lone rider, silhouetted against the dying light, a figure of broad shoulders and a posture that spoke of solitude, of a man carved from the rugged land itself. He didn't look at her, didn't offer a glance of pity or scorn, merely rode past, a phantom of the twilight, leaving behind a subtle scent of leather and dust, a hint of something primal and unburdened by the town's petty judgments. The sun rose again, a brazen eye in a cloudless sky, burning away the brief respite of night. Ayanna found herself with no choice but to seek work, however menial, however meager the pay. Her desperate inquiries at the general store, then the saloon, were met with the same tightly lipped politeness that thinly veiled suspicion. "No work here for your kind," a saloon keeper muttered, his gaze lingering too long on her unfamiliar dress. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, a silent condemnation not of her capabilities, but of her very origin. She walked the dusty streets, the weight of her helplessness pressing down, her spirit a raw wound. It was then, while seeking water at a communal pump, that she saw him again, the solitary rider from last night now closer, his face etched with the harsh lines of sun and wind, a permanent scowl softening only slightly around eyes that held a weary depth. Silas, they called him, a rancher from the outlying properties, a man known for his reticence and his fierce independence. He was loading supplies onto a rugged wagon, his movements economical, precise. He didn't acknowledge her presence directly, but a flicker of something, perhaps a flicker of recognition, crossed his face. Then, the man who had rejected her the day before, Mr. Abernathy, sauntered by, his chest puffed out with self-importance. He caught sight of Ayanna and sneered. "Still loitering, I see. Best be moving along, girl. This town has no use for vagrants, especially those without a dime to their name." The words were a public humiliation, a stark reminder of her shame. Silas, who had been tying down a canvas tarp, paused, his head lifted slowly, his gaze usually fixed on the horizon, now settled on Abernathy. There was no grand speech, no dramatic intervention. He simply held Abernathy's gaze, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a tension that crackled between them. Abernathy, for all his bluster, seemed to deflate slightly under Silas's steady, unblinking stare. He mumbled something unintelligible and hastened his pace. Silas then turned, his eyes finally meeting Ayanna's. They were not pitying nor scornful, but held a raw, unreadable depth. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, the words cutting through the tense silence. "You looking for work?" It wasn't an invitation, more a statement of fact, but in that stark inquiry lay a fragile thread of possibility, a lifeline thrown into her sea of despair. The question hung in the air, a stark, unexpected offering. Ayanna's first instinct was suspicion. Why him? Why now, when all others had turned away? What did a man like him, so seemingly self-contained and solitary, want with a woman like her, stripped of all but her quiet dignity? Yet, desperation was a potent persuader, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. She nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. "I can work," she said, her voice thin, rusty from disuse. Silas merely grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. He didn't offer a hand, didn't soften his gaze. He simply pointed with his chin towards the back of his wagon. "My ranch is a day's ride. Hard work, no easy living." His words were a blunt appraisal of the life he offered, stripped of any pretense or false hope. There was no patronizing tone, no hint of charity, only a directness that, paradoxically, offered a strange kind of respect. She hoisted herself onto the wagon, the rough wood scraping against her worn skirt, the dust rising around her in a brief, suffocating cloud. As the wagon jolted forward, pulling away from the judgment of the town, Ayanna found herself staring at Silas's broad back. He was a mystery, a man who seemed to belong more to the unforgiving landscape than to any human community. The journey was long, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the wheels and the distant cries of unseen birds. Silas offered no conversation, no small talk, only the occasional terse instruction to hold on as they navigated particularly rough terrain. She watched him, observing the way his hands gripped the reins, the effortless way he moved with the sway of the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. There was a quiet competence about him, a deep-seated connection to the land that resonated with something ancient within her own spirit. She thought of her grandfather, the way he could read the signs in the earth, the language of the wind. A wave of homesickness washed over her, a sharp pang for the familiar contours of her homeland, for the warmth of her grandmother's hogan. But even as that longing intensified, a strange sense of calm began to settle within her. Here, on the open road, under the vast, indifferent sky, she was free from the petty gazes of the town, free from the weight of their silent accusations. Here, she was simply a person, riding towards an uncertain future, but at least a future no longer defined by another's cruel rejection. The ranch was not a home. It was a collection of stark, functional buildings huddled against the vast, empty plains, a bastion against the relentless elements. Silas's cabin was rough-hewn, smelling of wood smoke and dried earth, and offered little comfort. Ayanna was given a small, separate lean-to, barely more than a shed, but it was her own space, a fragile sanctuary. The work began immediately, relentless and unforgiving. She learned to mend fences, her fingers raw and bleeding, to tend to the meager garden, coaxing life from the arid soil, to care for the horses with a quiet patience that surprised Silas. He was a hard taskmaster, expecting diligence and effort, but he was also fair, his expectations always clear, his criticisms devoid of malice. He saw her competence, not her origin, her utility, not her past. Days blurred into weeks, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, by the rhythm of physical labor. They worked side by side, often in silence, their breaths mingling with the dust and the scent of sagebrush. Ayanna found a strange solace in this unspoken companionship. Silas rarely spoke of himself, and she, cautious and guarded, offered little of her own history. Yet in the shared sweat and effort, a deeper understanding began to form, a language spoken through actions. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, she watched Silas from the lean-to, silhouetted against the afterglow as he watered his horses. There was a gentleness in his movements, a quiet respect for the creatures in his care, that contradicted his gruff exterior. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of her own younger brother, gravely ill, and the desperate, futile prayers she had offered, the helplessness that had gnawed at her. She had been forced to make a terrible choice, a sacrifice for the survival of her family that had left a lasting scar, a whisper of guilt that followed her even now. It was this unspoken burden that had propelled her across the miles, a longing for absolution disguised as a search for a new life. She looked at Silas again, standing alone in the fading light, a man seemingly unburdened by the complexities of the world, yet bearing the weight of his own silent solitude. A fragile curiosity stirred within her. What stories did this quiet man carry in his own heart? What unspoken struggles had shaped him into the solitary figure he was? The vastness of the plains, once mocking, now felt less daunting, perhaps even a reflection of the unspoken truths that lay between them, waiting to be revealed. The rhythm of ranch life, harsh as it was, began to weave itself into Ayanna's very being, a steadying pulse that replaced the chaotic thrum of her past anxieties. She found a quiet satisfaction in the ache of her muscles at the end of a long day, in the small triumphs of coaxing a stubborn seedling to grow, or calming a skittish horse. Silas, for his part, remained an enigma, but a subtle shift had occurred. His terse commands occasionally softened into something less demanding, more collaborative. He noticed the small details, her meticulous care for the tools, the way she instinctively knew which mare was ailing, the quiet dignity with which she faced every challenge. One sweltering afternoon, a sudden, violent dust storm descended upon them, blinding and suffocating. Ayanna, caught outside, stumbled, disoriented by the swirling grit. Suddenly, a hand, strong and calloused, gripped her arm, pulling her towards the comparative shelter of the barn. Silas, his face obscured by the driving dust, did not speak, but the firmness of his hold, the protective arc of his body as he shielded her from the wind, spoke volumes. Inside the barn, as the storm raged outside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and horse and a silence that felt profound. Silas leaned against a stall, his breathing heavy, his eyes, when he finally met hers, holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Concern, perhaps, or a rare glimpse into a hidden vulnerability. He gestured to a small, hand-carved wooden bird perched on a beam. "My mother made that," he rumbled, his voice rougher than usual. said it meant hope. Never flew, though. It was a sparse confession, a tiny window into a deeply private world. But it was enough. Ayanna felt a tightening in her chest, a recognition of shared loneliness, of dreams unfulfilled. She understood then that beneath his gruff exterior lay a man shaped by his own quiet sorrows, a man who, like her, carried the weight of unspoken longings. The outside world, however, refused to ignore them. Weekly trips into town for supplies became a gauntlet of stares and hushed whispers. The general store proprietor, Mr. Ray Henderson, once merely suspicious, now wore an expression of open disapproval. "Heard you got an Indian woman living out at your place, Silas," he drawled one afternoon, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Folks are talking. Ain't right. A white man like you with one of them." The words were a direct assault, laced with the casual cruelty of deeply ingrained prejudice. Ayanna felt a familiar chill, a rising tide of shame. She braced herself for Silas to distance himself, to deny, to explain. But he didn't. He simply set down a sack of flour with a thud that rattled the counter, his gaze cold and unwavering, fixed on Henderson. The silence that followed was heavy, taut with unspoken challenge. The air in the general store crackled, thick with the unspoken tension that filled the small space. Henderson, for all his bluster, visibly recoiled under Silas's unwavering stare. "Just saying what folks are saying, Silas," he mumbled, his bravado crumbling. But Silas did not relent. "Folks can say what they please," he rumbled, his voice low but carrying an undeniable steel. "This is my land, my life, and she's got a name, Ayanna." The explicit declaration of her name, uttered with an unexpected reverence, resonated through Ayanna, a shockwave of recognition and a profound sense of being seen. It was a stark contrast to the dismissal she had always received, a public reclamation of her identity by a man who barely spoke. Outside the store, as Silas loaded their supplies, the weight of Henderson's words settled heavily upon Ayanna. "They talk about you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the raw edge of fear in her tone. "It isn't right for you." Silas paused, his movements deliberate. He turned to face her, his gaze intense, searching. "What isn't right?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of its usual gruffness. "Their judgment, their words, they'll shame you. They'll bring trouble." She expected dismissal, perhaps even an exasperated sigh. Instead, he reached out, his calloused hand gently tracing the intricate pattern of her shawl. "Let them talk," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I don't live by their whispers. I live by what's real." His words were a balm, a quiet defiance that offered her a fragile shield against the world's harshness. In that moment, a crucial piece of the mystery that was Silas unfurled. He had not always been this solitary, this self-contained. There was a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of pain in his eyes as he spoke, a glimpse of a past wound that had forged his fierce independence. He had once been part of a community, a family perhaps, but something had shattered that connection, leaving him an outcast in his own way, much like herself. His land, his ranch, was not merely a source of livelihood. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from a world that had perhaps failed him too. This shared understanding, this silent acknowledgement of their parallel exiles, deepened the nascent bond between them. It was a revelation not of a grand, dramatic secret, but of a quiet, profound kinship born from shared isolation and resilience. Ayanna looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a rancher, but a fellow traveler, a soul forged in the crucible of hardship, capable of a fierce loyalty that transcended the petty prejudices of society. The revelation of Silas's own solitary history, glimpsed in a fleeting expression, cemented a connection that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Yet even as their unspoken bond deepened, a shadow lingered over Ayanna, a persistent echo from her past that threatened to consume her. It was a memory not of a cruel word or a dismissive glance, but of a desperate, wrenching decision she had made, a choice born of necessity but weighed down by guilt. Ayanna remembered the winter, a season of unforgiving cold, when the crops had failed and the livestock had withered. Her younger sister, small and frail, had fallen ill, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Their family, proud and resilient, had slowly succumbed to the hunger and the despair. The elder medicine woman had spoken of a desperate measure, a trade with the spirits of the land, a sacrifice to appease the unforgiving forces of nature. Ayanna, then barely a woman, had offered herself. Not to a man, not for marriage, but to leave her family, to seek a future far away, to become a burden lifted, so that the meager remaining resources could sustain her siblings. She had been the strongest, the most capable, and in her youthful idealism, she believed her departure would be the turning point, the act that would save them. The journey across the plains had been her penance, a physical manifestation of her self-imposed exile, the vastness of the land, a mirror to the emptiness she carried within. The rejection in town had merely confirmed her deepest fear, that she was inherently unworthy, forever tainted by her past choices, forever paying a price. She had tried to outrun the guilt, the memory of her sister's fevered brow, the quiet despair in her mother's eyes as Ayanna had walked away. This was her flaw, her emotional complexity, not a grand vice but a profound self-blame, a belief that her very presence was a curse. Now, on Silas's ranch, with his quiet strength offering a fragile hope, this ancient wound felt raw again. Could she, a woman marked by such a past, truly accept a kindness so unexpected, so undeserved? The stark landscape around them seemed to mock her, the endless horizon a reminder of the distance between her past self and the possibility of a new beginning. She often stared at the distant mountains, their peaks sharp against the sky, wondering if they held the answers to her quiet torment, if the wind that swept through the canyons could somehow carry away the lingering shadow of her sacrifice. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. She had been rejected for being too poor, but her true poverty lay not in her empty purse, but in the belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, unworthy of true acceptance. The wind carried the scent of an approaching storm, a palpable shift in the air, mirroring the tempest brewing within Ayanna. Her internal battle, a silent war against the specter of her past, reached its crescendo. She found herself standing on the edge of the sprawling ranch, gazing out at the vast expanse, the setting sun painting the sky in violent streaks of crimson and bruised purple. It was a canvas of dramatic beauty, yet it felt heavy, oppressive, reflecting the tumultuous landscape of her soul. Silas found her there, his presence a quiet anchor against the wildness of the approaching night. He didn't speak, but his gaze, when she finally turned to him, held an uncharacteristic softness, a depth of understanding that startled her. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotion, until Ayanna, propelled by a desperate need for release, finally broke it. "You don't know," she whispered, her voice raw, fractured by the dam of her composure. "You don't know what I did, what I left behind. I am a burden." Her words were a confession, torn from the deepest part of her being, a self-condemnation she had carried for so long. She expected disgust, a confirmation of her worst fears, another rejection, perhaps more painful than the first. Silas stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, enveloping her in a strange sense of protective calm. He took her hands, his grip firm, reassuring. His thumbs gently stroked the raw skin of her palms, testament to the shared labor, the physical scars that bound them. "I know enough," he rumbled, his voice low, steady, a counterpoint to the rising wind. "I know what I see. I see a woman who works harder than any man I know, a woman who sees things others miss, a woman who finds beauty in this dust-choked land." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her face, piercing through her defenses, seeing beyond the veil of her perceived flaws. "And I know what I feel. You are not a burden, Ayanna. You are a quiet strength. You are light in the dark. You are my world." The words hung in the air, simple, profound, stripping away her defenses, dissolving the layers of shame and self-recrimination she had worn like a shroud. The storm broke then, not just in the sky, but within her. Tears, hot and abundant, streamed down her face, a release of years of pent-up sorrow and unspoken guilt. It was an emotional climax, a raw, unburdening moment. Silas didn't flinch, didn't recoil. He simply held her, his arms wrapping around her, offering a sanctuary she had never dared to dream of. In that embrace, surrounded by the raging storm and the vast, unforgiving land, Ayanna felt a profound shift. The burden began to lift, replaced by a tentative, blossoming hope. The storm raged around them, a furious symphony of wind and rain, but within Silas's embrace, Ayanna felt a calm settle over her that was more profound than any she had ever known. His words, "You are my world," echoed in the chambers of her heart, dismantling the carefully constructed walls of self-doubt she had built over a lifetime. It wasn't a sudden erasure of her past, but a quiet, powerful acceptance of it, a gentle invitation to lay down the heavy burden she had carried. When the storm finally subsided, leaving the air washed clean and the land glistening under the emerging moonlight, a new dawn seemed to break not just over the plains, but within Ayanna's spirit. She looked at Silas, his face etched with the weariness of a life lived hard, yet softened by an undeniable tenderness. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes, a silent promise of partnership. She saw him not as a savior, but as a fellow survivor, a man who had chosen to see her worth beyond the superficial judgments of the world. Her acceptance of his words was not a surrender, but an awakening. She had journeyed across a vast, hostile land, seeking a future, only to find it in the most unexpected of places, with a man who understood the silent language of the heart. The irony of her initial rejection, deemed too poor by a shallow man, now felt like a cruel trick of fate that had inadvertently led her to true abundance. The town, with its whispering prejudices, seemed distant, their judgments fading into the background hum of irrelevance. Their lives, forged in the crucible of this wild land, would be built on the bedrock of shared struggle and a quiet, profound respect. There would be no grand declarations, no sweeping romantic gestures, for their bond was rooted in the tangible realities of their existence, in the unspoken rhythms of their shared labor, in the quiet solitude that only they truly understood. She had found a home not in a house, but in the unwavering gaze of a man who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. The hopeful resolution was not a fairy tale ending, but a grounded, resilient beginning, built on the sturdy foundation of acceptance and a deep, abiding connection that transcended words. The land, once unforgiving, now held the promise of growth, of a future forged in shared purpose, where the echoes of her past could finally find a quiet resting place. The years that followed were not without their trials, for life on the plains was inherently unforgiving, demanding constant resilience and fortitude. Yet, Ayanna and Silas faced each challenge not as individuals, but as an unbreakable unit, their bond deepening with each passing season. The harsh sun, the biting winds, the relentless demands of the ranch, all served to temper their spirits, forging a connection more robust than any superficial affection. The land, which had once felt so alien, began to yield its secrets to Ayanna, and in turn she discovered a new sense of belonging, not in the ancestral canyons of her youth, but in the quiet, steadfast rhythm of this chosen home. She learned to read the clouds for rain, to understand the subtle shifts in the wind. Her hands, once raw, now calloused and capable, finding purpose in the daily tending of their small world. Silas, for his part, remained a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he ensured her lean-to was always watertight, the quiet pride in his eyes when she successfully brought a new calf into the world, the subtle pressure of his hand on her back as they worked side by side in the fields. These were the declarations of his steadfast love, a love unburdened by the empty rhetoric of society. The occasional visits to town continued, and while the whispers never entirely ceased, their sting had diminished, replaced by a quiet defiance in Ayanna's heart. She walked with her head held high, no longer burdened by the judgment of others, for her worth was now affirmed by the man beside her, by the life they were building together. The man who had once rejected her, Mr. Abernathy, now avoided her gaze, his petty cruelty dwarfed by the quiet dignity of their existence. It was a triumph of the human spirit, a testament to the enduring power of acceptance in a world so quick to condemn. Ayanna, once a mail-order bride deemed too poor, had found a wealth far beyond gold or silver. She had found a love that saw her beyond the surface, a partnership that cherished her strength, and a home forged in the shared silence of two solitary souls who had found their whole world in each other. Their story became a quiet legend in the dust-swept plains, a poignant reminder that true belonging is not always found where it is sought, but sometimes, surprisingly, in the arms of one who calls you their very essence.